Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac Address. My name is Corey McLeod. I'm a director of the National Press Club and the publisher of InnovationAus.com, an independent publication reporting on the Australian tech and innovation sector. Today we're talking about adolescence and masculinity, or more specifically, masculinities. There is an urgent national conversation underway about young people's online lives, masculinity, teen mental health, gender equity and violence among young people, including technology-facilitated abuse. Today, our speakers will launch the Adolescent Man Box Report. It's an Australian-first study that surveyed 1,400 teens of all genders to understand the extent to which they endorse a set of rigid masculine norms. It provides essential evidence for shaping a safer, healthier future for all Australians. Matt Tyler is Executive Director of the Men's Project at Jesuit Social Services. He's one of Australia's leading advocates focused on improving the lives of children and young people. He has led groundbreaking work to reduce violence, prevent child sexual abuse and promote the ability for men and boys to flourish. Professor Kate Fitz-Gibbon is an international expert in domestic and family violence. She's a professor with the Faculty of Business and Economics at Monash University, the chair of Respect Victoria, and the author of our national crisis, Violence Against Women and Children. You often hear older people saying, geez, I'm glad I'm not growing up today. It's so fraught and seems so complicated. Indeed it is. And we're grateful to our two speakers who will shed some light on their experience. Please join me in welcoming Matt Tyler and Kate Fitz-Gibbon.
Corey, thank you for that really generous introduction. And to you, Morris, Press Club board members, thank you for hosting us today. It's a real privilege to be invited to give this address. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and pay respects to their elders, past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge victim survivors of all forms of violence and abuse today, including victim survivors who join us in this room today who are watching online. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Melanie Thompson, who has led the development of the Adolescent Man Box research, together with Jane Lloyd and all members of the Jesuit Social Services team who have contributed to this work. I'd also like to thank our donors who made this possible. In the absence of any government funding, this work would not have happened without your support. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge all of you in this room and many watching online for your sustained and often unheralded efforts to engage men and boys to prevent violence and abuse. I count many of you as friends, and we're really grateful to each of you for joining us today. Children should be seen and not heard. This is a refrain that was once commonplace. It's clear here where children sit. Their lack of standing. First coined over 600 years ago, this worldview has endured for a remarkably long time. But the world moves, our nation moves. Our nation only moves, though, when people speak up. All of us, leaders in this room and many others, can and do play their role here. This includes elevating, listening to, and acting on the experiences of young people. Today, we'll hear perspectives from over 1,400 young people of all genders from right across the country who Jesuit Social Services surveyed as part of the Adolescent Man Box study. This research builds on Jesuit Social Services' almost 50-year history working with men and boys. And for over 20 years, this work has taken place under the leadership of our CEO, Julie Edwards, who is here today. I'd like to acknowledge, Julie, your astounding contribution over this time in the pursuit of social justice, together with our chair, also in attendance today, Frances Sullivan. Jesuit Social Services is a social change organisation which started and continues to work with men and boys involved in the criminal justice system. Grounded in this experience, in 2017 we established the Men's Project, wanting to intervene earlier to address a range of harmful behaviours, including the use of violence, and importantly, also wanting to see men and boys flourish themselves. As part of this, we seek to understand the underlying root causes of what's going on for men and boys, the role of socially constructed ideas related to gender, which permeate all of our lives, the impacts of trauma, including the reality that the majority of our youth and adult justice participants at Jesuit social services have experienced violence or abuse in their childhoods. We've sought to understand what men think, their life experiences, including through our adult man box research, with the most recent iteration completed in partnership with Respect Victoria. The research we're releasing today builds on that effort to understand the perspectives of adolescents. The Adolescent Man Box is made up of 4 pillars. First, constantly maintaining a tough and confident persona. Being emotionally stoic, not being girly or gay, and doling out and standing up to being teased. This research has been motivated by what we've seen at the front line as part of our work with men and boys. This is what we hear from some of our participants each and every day. My job is to protect her. That's why I want to know where she is. I was raised around fighters and was raised to be a fighter too. No one understands me. People just keep telling me what to do. Too often, young people share their lived experience and they are then asked to take responsibility for making progress. Adults fail to hold up their end of the bargain, to use the power they have to act. Today, we'll outline practical actions that would result in progress. There's, of course, a lot spoken about the need to engage men and boys, to genuinely seek to understand their realities and also hold them accountable for their behaviour. I want to acknowledge this is challenging terrain. How can we empathise with men and boys who are feeling cancelled, rejected, or hard done by when women are still being killed on a weekly basis? Standing with victim survivors as at the centre of this work is crucial. And the victim survivor statement in the National Plan calls out a simple truth. Abuse and violence is a problem for victims, but it is not the victim's problem. Advocates such as Lula Dembele have asked us to face the reality that we will not end men's violence without better understanding why men use violence. And inevitably, this must include a focus on boys. So what then is going on for teenage boys? Based on our survey of over 1,400 adolescents, we found that the majority, regardless of gender, believe that most people in Australia expect teenage boys to be tough, to be confident, strong, and never back away from a challenge. These ideas are not negative in and of themselves. It's when these ideas become deeply infused with one's identity or serve as a boy's means to belong, holding on to them at all costs, that's when we see negative outcomes. And yet, in good news, relative to the perception of social pressures, far fewer boys endorse these ideas themselves. And this is particularly the case for girls, who are much more likely to reject these ideas. That's a compelling pitch if you're a heterosexual teenage boy. Girls don't want you showing up, being the big dog alpha. And I've shared this with a few women already, and they've looked at me and said, yep, That's a really compelling message that we want to see translated into practice, including as part of work in schools. There are other reasons for hope too. As part of this research, we found that most adolescents remain optimistic about the future. Most believe in gender equality and reject sexist behaviours. And a significant number of adolescents believe it's okay for boys to talk openly about their problems and comfort one another. I've seen this firsthand working in the Kimberley, connecting with young fellas. Some shared it's the first time as part of those conversations that someone has checked in on their well-being. They talk about how their lian had been lifted following these conversations. Boys will open up when given the chance. We're hopeful too that we found that parents, as well as male friends, are perceived by adolescent boys to have a more significant impact on their attitudes than online influencers or social media. And importantly, in spite of frequent and I'd say important calls for more male role models, both mums and dads are rated by adolescents as having a big impact on their ideas related to masculinities. As the son of a single mum, this really lands for me. Dad fell a long way short, horribly addicted to gambling, full of potential but crippled by addiction. And without mum, I would have been in a lot of trouble. As it happens, mum was also Dolly Doctor. And for those who are curious, the letters were real. And in the context of challenges facing adolescents today, knowing laughs. Credible, accessible advice that's also cool seems increasingly rare. I'll now turn to some of the challenges presented by this study. Over 2/3 of boys agreed with more than half of the 27 Adolescent Man Box rules. And looking at some of these specific rules, just to give you a feel, 1 in 4 boys believe that acting manly should be the most important goal and you should never back down from a challenge in public. Nearly 1 in 4 believe that if your feelings are hurt, you should hold it in. And 1 in 3 believe that it's embarrassing to have a lot of gay friends. I want to particularly focus on the group of boys who most endorse these Adolescent Man Box rules. Relative to boys who don't endorse these ideas, your life is lonely, although you don't necessarily reveal that to anyone, instead showing up in ways that allow you to fit in, to belong with your mask firmly in place. You've likely been a victim of violence and connect people better through online gaming than you do in person. You feel that no one really knows you well, believe boys have it harder than girls, you gamble, you drink. You're also more likely to bully and physically hurt someone on purpose and make sexual comments to people you don't know. And you're much more likely than other boys to agree that if a teenage boy has sex with a teenage girl, he should decide what happens and what she does during sex. For the remainder of this speech, we want to focus on 5 areas that this research has suggested demand greater action. First, addressing harm which takes place in digital environments, including the astounding prevalence, which we found in this study, of image-based abuse, digital surveillance, and our focus today, harmful pornography. As part of this study, we found that many adolescents exposed to pornography viewed unsafe, aggressive, and non-consensual acts. Take, for example, Leo, a 13-year-old who we interviewed as part of our work at Jesuit Social Services to prevent people's use of harmful sexual behaviour. Leo lives with his mum and dad. He goes to school, plays footy. Nobody knew that Leo was hiding a dark secret. He'd been watching pornography since he was 8 years old, and recently he'd started watching illegal content, child sexual abuse material. After watching the material, he was filled with guilt, filled with a sense of isolation. In his own words, he wondered if he was a monster, and he felt he could tell no one. He tried to act out the material on his younger sister, and when the police walked into his bedroom before school to arrest him, he wasn't surprised. The social media delay and age verification as it relates to pornography will directly reduce harm, including on platforms where children are currently being groomed. But more is needed, including targeting specific types of content. We note progress just this week in the UK where the depiction of strangulation in pornography will be banned. Two areas that we call out warranting particular attention are infinite scroll and the way algorithms often work to promote harmful content. The evidence on this is clear. For instance, studies by a global witness and separately the University College London focused on TikTok found young people are being served up a reinforcing loop of sexualised, misogynistic, violent and racist content. This is dopaminic capitalism at the extreme with profit at its core. We would not tolerate this level of harm with any other product. There's a need for better regulation, greater transparency, the ability for users to opt out and reset the algorithm, and warning messages to disrupt harmful content or compulsive use. The steps taken by the Australian Government and the E-Safety Commissioner are welcome, and there is still much to do. Shifting now to our second area where there is a need for greater action, we must dramatically increase the scale of early intervention work with boys to prevent violence. Many of the outcomes foregrounded in this research, the use of violence, substance use, and poor mental health are at least partly related to the impacts of trauma. This effort should explicitly target masculinities, which underpin cycles of retaliation, performative post and boast crimes, and the behaviour of boys in groups. We're missing opportunities in so many places. When an adolescent uses violence at home, in alternative learning settings, or following early engagement with police. A greater focus on early intervention stands in stark contrast to the trend across several states and territories towards predominantly punitive responses, where young people's use of harmful behaviour is punished through juvenile justice. The children that are being locked up are more often than not victims of family violence or other forms of child abuse first, and have engaged in criminal activity second. Yet the focus on punishment, not healing, nor restoration, which holds young people to account for their actions. That's the reality we're facing across many states and territories in Australia today. And as I close, I'd like to ask you to genuinely think about the reality of a young fella who had been in Parkville, a juvenile detention facility in Melbourne, who's now attending our school, the Ignatius Learning Centre. I asked him how he was finding being with us. He looked me straight in the eye and said it's the first place he's ever felt safe. He had never felt safe, and yet the moment his behaviour went awry, the justice system came down hard. We can and we must do better. With action, we can make progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you to Julie Edwards, Francis Sullivan, and all members of the Jesuit Social Services team for the opportunity to contribute to today's launch. Like Matt, I'm also very grateful to have so many colleagues, friends, and family in the room today. Thank you so much for your support of this work. And thank you also for showing up and showing that this is an issue that matters. In particular, I would like to acknowledge Connor Paul, who has been courageous and relentless in his advocacy to improve the system for child victims of family violence. Thank you, Connor. I first came to this work as a young woman, wanting to better understand how the father of a good friend of mine at school could possibly have killed her mum. That crime ruptured what was a very safe bubble that I'd had the good fortune to live in up until that point. In that case, Julie left her abusive husband. She commenced a new relationship shortly after, and 6 weeks after she left him, her estranged husband killed her. It's a pattern of femicide that continues to play out all too often in this country. I've studied this, and the leading work of Dr. Hayley Boxall also shows us this. In the courts, he received a lesser verdict on the basis of provocation, in part because of a remark she allegedly made about her new lover being better in bed than him. At the core was rejection. That killing occurred over 20 years ago. When I read the Adolescent Man Box findings, there was one finding that stood out for me. For those teenage boys that adhere to these rigid masculine norms, when rejected, they were 3 times more likely to report retaliating than boys at the opposite end of the Adolescent Man Box scale. I'm reminded so often of the negative outcomes, sometimes fatal, of the failure to deal with rejection. Earlier this year, I provided expert evidence as part of the coronial inquest into the killing of Lily James and the death of Paul Tyson. Lily was allegedly killed by her ex-boyfriend Paul at her workplace, St Andrew's Cathedral School in Sydney. She was 21 years old. Paul was 24. During their brief dating relationship, Paul exhibited jealous behaviours. He engaged in in-person stalking behaviours after their relationship had ended, and he monitored Lily's location via Snapchat. Frighteningly, findings from the Adolescent Man Box study show that these beliefs from Paul are not unique amongst adolescent boys in Australia. Of those adolescent boys who most strongly endorse the Man Box rules, that 35% agree that if a teenage boy has a girlfriend, he should know where she is all the time. Equally, 35% agree that they usually try to get back at someone if they are rejected. In the lead up to the killing of Lily, their friendship group mistook Paul's repetitive monitoring of Lily's location as a sign of affection rather than an indicator of risk. And at the coronial inquest on the final day, Lily's parents provided a heartbreaking statement. Lily's mum, Peter, said, "As parents, if we are not teaching our sons how to respect a woman's opinions and choices and accept rejection, we could be setting our daughters up for failure." As a country, we must do better. While Australia can absolutely be proud of its efforts to develop and deliver respectful relationships education in every state and territory, this study provides an opportunity to check in on the currency of that curriculum. For example, are we educating young people about how to use location tracking features in safe ways? Can adolescents identify the risks of digital surveillance? Have we taught boys how to cope with rejection? How to sit safely with the discomfort of being told no? And have we taught parents how to instill those skills in their sons? Respectful relationships curriculum, as well as a range of other school-based initiatives and programs, have to reflect the contemporary issues that adolescents are facing. Which brings me to the fourth area where we believe there's a need for greater action: supporting help seeking amongst adolescent boys. The death of Paul Tyson also illuminated the consequences when boys and men don't have the skills and confidence to seek help. There was much in Paul's life that was spiralling out of control in the lead up to his fatal actions. Yet as far as the evidence shows, Paul did not seek help from his friends, from family, or from services. This increases the risk of harm, not only for Paul, but for all the people in his life. At the extreme end, Jane Monckton-Smith in the UK has often said, if he says he's going to kill himself, take it as a threat that he will kill her. This reluctance to seek help amongst young boys is not unique to Paul. The Adolescent Man Box study shows that nearly 4 in 5 adolescents report a poor mental health symptom over the past 2 weeks. Noting that girls report higher rates of mental ill health, nearly 3 in 5 adolescent boys reported feeling down, depressed, or hopeless. And herein lies the connection. While adolescent boys are experiencing significant distress in their lives, they do not want to nor know how to seek help. The study showed that boys are far less likely than girls to seek help. We have to upskill adolescent boys. We have to challenge the underlying cultures that are prohibiting vulnerability. We also need to develop resources that can promote help seeking in the offline and the online environments in which adolescents spend their time. A word of caution though. Given what has been documented about the current lack of child-specific supports for young people who have experienced violence and abuse, it would be irresponsible at this point to encourage help seeking amongst adolescents before we have fully funded and embedded the services that they will need. Which brings me to the final area where we need to drive greater action: system responses to young victim survivors. The Adolescent Man Box study found 2 in 5 adolescents have experienced victimisation. They've been physically hurt on purpose, sexually harassed, insulted, or threatened, including online. Crucially, the study also found that of adolescent boys who report using aggression in the past month, 80% also report that they've been victimised in the same period. Here, we have a significant opportunity. Addressing the harms of victimisation, supporting young victim survivors to recover and heal is prevention. It directly addresses the risks of intergenerational violence. But we are falling short. In recent years, as part of my research, I've interviewed over 100 child victims. And consistently, I've heard about the ways in which systems have failed. Despite the best efforts of frontline staff who are working with a tiny fraction of the resources they need, we have a service system which allows young people's needs to go unmet and their risks unseen. And we lack the meaningful action to support safety, recovery, and healing for child victim survivors. We have an evidence-based need, though, for these services at scale across this country. In April 2023, the Australian Child Maltreatment Study found that nearly 1 in 3 Australian children experience physical abuse. 28% experience sexual abuse, and nearly 2 in 5 Australian children will grow up with domestic and family violence in their household. This is the reality of Australian children's lives. And yet, while you may think that those statistics alone would propel governments into action, in the 31 months since their release, nearly 1,000 days, little action has followed. And forgive me for being impatient, but it is, after all, now over 11 years since the horrific killing of Luke Batty. And while responsibility for the killing of Luke sits with Greg Anderson alone, Coroner Ian Gray's inquiry findings were clear. The system at the time failed to intervene and to prevent Luke's death, despite numerous opportunities to do so. So isn't it ironic then that in almost a decade of reform activity and political commitments, energised in large part by Luke's mum, former Australian of the Year, Rosie Batty, relatively little has been done in practice that would have improved Luke's safety. And that's not said to undermine the significant program of reform that states and territories have actioned, none more so than my home jurisdiction of Victoria. But I would put it to you that while there are some notable exceptions, those efforts have been largely adult-focused. And that's not the only time that's happened. To what extent, for example, have the Queensland reforms centred children's risk and safety since the horrific killings of Hannah Clark and her 3 children, Trey, Liana and Elia? Why, as a nation, are we not propelled to act on children's risk? And yes, I acknowledge we have a national plan to end violence against women, our 10-year strategy, which embeds a recognition of children as victim survivors in their own right. And policy recognition is important. But in the 3 years since that plan's launch, it is challenging to point to the concrete funded actions which bring that recognition to life. We have wondered whether this inaction stems from the lack of a dedicated focus on children in the federal government. Unlike other countries, New Zealand included, Australia does not have a dedicated Minister for Children. So echoing Anne Hollins, the former National Children's Commissioner, the late Joe Tucci and others, we call for the introduction of a federal Minister for Children. This role would provide important cross-portfolio leadership on children's wellbeing and safety and coordination across jurisdictions. It could drive a longer-term reform agenda across all of the settings that children live, learn and play. We've also wondered whether inaction is due to the siloing of our current efforts to address children's experiences of violence and abuse. We have a national plan to end violence against women and children with a focus on domestic, family and sexual violence. There is also Safe and Supported, a national framework focused on child abuse and neglect. And thirdly, we have a national strategy to prevent and respond to child sexual abuse. Each of these have a first action plan sitting underneath them. And over the next 2 years, the government has committed to developing a second action plan for each of these. We are at risk of spending more time planning than acting. And our siloed approach stands in contrast with the reality of children's experiences. The child maltreatment study found that 1 in 4 Australians experience between 3 and 5 different forms of child abuse and violence. Yet our plans are siloed. So to shift this status quo, we first need action-oriented investment now. There are clear gaps that should be addressed, including funding interventions and supports focused on healing and recovery for children and young people. Then, and to integrate efforts, we are calling for the federal government to develop and deliver a dedicated 5-year action plan for children and young people who have been victims of violence and abuse. But let us be very clear, this is not a recommendation for a plan for the sake of another plan. This one action plan will consolidate efforts across government and provide an accountable, laser focus, explicitly addressing all forms of violence and abuse experienced by children and young people. So in closing, and to return to where Matt started, children must be seen and heard. And as adults, we must act. It is our responsibility to do so. Last year in this room, launching her second book, Hope, Rosie Batty commented that it could have just as easily been called Despair. But she chose hope. And we believe there's reason to be hopeful. We know the challenge. And the evidence base points us to the solutions. Therein lies the hope of what we can do now if there is political will to do so. So today, using this national stage, we ask the leaders of our country, show you care, not with words, with tangible, transformational actions for children and young people. Thank you so much.
Thank you to both of you. I think the way that you presented both of your addresses married together perfectly, I think, and getting to the real heart of masculinity and young people, and then I guess some of the impact that's having, particularly around domestic violence and women. Calling for a minister for children, I mean, it makes complete sense to get some of that system-wide change happening. The plan fatigue, I get completely. Talking about some of the specific actions. So if we talk about a 5-year plan that has actions attached to it, is there low-hanging fruit? I mean, what are the 3 things, say, that could be done in the next 12 months that would start getting to the heart of shifting some of these silos?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question, Corrie. There's absolutely low-hanging fruit, and we've seen across a number of research studies, the recent South Australian Royal Commission into domestic, family and sexual violence, numerous inquiries led by Anne Hollins in her former role as National Children's Commissioner, articulation of the reforms that could happen now at the federal level and the state and territory level. Some of the immediate actions that are drawn out and recommended in the study is to fund child-specific domestic, family and sexual violence services in every state and territory. We do not have that. We also do not have the level of workforce capacity that we need. The result of that is that often when children disclose, they disclose to adults in their lives that do not have the skills and the training to respond well to that disclosure. That is experienced by that child as either a dismissal, a minimisation of the violence that they've experienced, or feeling ignored. That may be the only time they ever seek help, and we miss that opportunity. So we need to upskill the workforce, and there's a call around that. The other really key call, and we have named it in the speech today, is an update of respectful relationships education, to take this work and translate it immediately into Australian schools to ensure that that curriculum reflects adolescents' lives today.
Corrie, there's a couple of things I'd add, and before doing so, I think it's important just to name the reality that we're currently not treating this issue around domestic, family, sexual violence, and particularly as it relates to children and young people. We're not acknowledging the scale of the challenge in the way we fund it. There's been progress. We're seeing record investments at a federal level, and yet the heart of this is politics. The heart of this is what matters. And we've got a Minister for Social Services in Tanya Plibersek who I think is impatient for progress. And yet that sits within the reality that we are not seeing sufficient action on a whole range of the areas that we've touched on today. I think 2 areas that I want to add to what Kate has shared. One is, whilst the Supporting Adolescent Boys trial is a helpful start as it relates to early intervention, there are massive gaps that we're missing to engage with boys who are at risk of not just using violence as adolescents, but we know from Hayley Boxall's work, those same boys go on to use violence as adults. And so we've got to see a massive scaling up of work to engage with boys who are at risk. The second thing I'd say relates to parents. A really hopeful finding in this report is adolescents are telling us that their parents really matter. And against the backdrop of the Netflix series Adolescence, there's a lot of fear around boys' online worlds. We've got to support parents to engage with young people on their lives as it relates to really contemporary issues raised in this study. When I was growing up, digital surveillance was not a thing that was occurring anywhere near to the same extent as it is now. Image-based abuse, the increasingly violent nature of pornography. we've got to equip parents with the resources they need to engage with adolescents in their lives on these issues.
Where would you go? There will be parents in this room, there will be parents watching who watched Adolescence. I know, amongst my, circles, everyone was a bit like, oh my gosh. Where would you go to get a snapshot of easy things to be able to understand the complex environment our young people are in and how to properly support them, that when the door is open, a parent can walk through it properly?
Yeah, I think first thing to say is there's massive gaps. I would acknowledge the really important work of Julie Grant and the Safety Commission. I think they've got a set of really valuable resources, and so for parents watching, that's a really good starting point. I'd also say this goes beyond to where you go. This goes to how to engage young people on these issues. Young people are telling us that they value the relationships that they have in the offline world. And so whilst I know it's hard, I've only got a little 3-year-old, Corey, and so I haven't reached a stage where I'm having to connect with an adolescent child. Continue the conversation, engage in ways that don't blame or shame, and even when it's difficult, just stick at it, because absent that, we know, and we heard the AFP Commissioner address the press club just last week, we know if those conversations break down and boys become disconnected, that really significant harm can occur.
Another question before I go to my colleagues. Talking about the system-wide work, there's so many levels to touch people and families at various places that are all incredibly important. Cultural and language diverse communities often add another layer to the way there's cultural practices, there's language barriers, particularly with parents. How much of that is sort of featured in your work, and is there any specific insights that can help in a multicultural Australia?
Perhaps I'll begin by just reflecting on some of the interviews that I've done with child victims, and certainly speaking with a range of different children and young people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. The barriers to accessing help just mount and mount and mount. We need to ensure that young people can access help that is accessible, that is child-friendly, and that looks and feels like their world, that is not intimidating, that is accessible in their language, that reflects a reality that they can see themselves within. The second we start expecting, an example, one young person said to me, in the midst of trauma, I can't navigate a website that's been written by adults for adults, and I definitely don't think that service is going to welcome me. And we need to do better, and I think that includes our work with culturally and linguistically diverse children and young people. We need to think about what is the interface into the system for them and how we're making it child-friendly, accessible and representative of the children of Australia.
First question is Nick Stewart from Ability News.
Thanks very much for your very important speech, which I think really touched so many people here today. I don't want to look back to some sort of mythical past where everything was perfect, but the thing that has changed, there are two issues. The first is electronic games, the electronic communications and so on, and also along with that a disintegration of other social clubs, means where boys in particular could act out particular role models and be involved in finding role models. Is that one of the major issues that really concerns you? And also, if the government had to do one thing that's really quite simple, wouldn't establishing a minister be the answer?
Nick, thank you for your question, and I sense your genuine interest and engagement with the speech that we've delivered today, and so thank you for that. I think you're right. There's been significant changes in terms of boys' online worlds, and I want to go to something that's a little deeper and a bit more fundamental, which is much of what we're raising as part of this work today goes to fundamental tenets of belonging, of connection, of purpose and meaning in boys' lives. When the reality for boys is they at times feel like they're on the back foot, they are far more likely to be at risk of going down online avenues, which can be really harmful. Real life, offline connections really matter. And we've seen a massive shift in our community in terms of fewer places where not just boys, but people of any gender, young people and adults can connect and engage with each other. And so I think you're picking up on something that's very real. I also think as it relates to the reality of the digital world, more can be done to mitigate harm. The eSafety Commission and the government have been left with little choice but to proceed with a social media delay, and we're really supportive of age verification as it relates to pornography. That will have impacts on some young people's ability to connect. We're hearing that from young people directly. I think though, in the absence of technology platforms taking responsibility for the harms that are being perpetrated on their platforms, we're left with little choice.
And thank you so much for the second part of that question. I absolutely agree. I think something that could be done now is the inclusion of a federal minister for children within the current federal government. It would mean that we have someone who is turning up to Parliament with a dedicated focus on children, that it's not one part in one setting of their portfolio. It is their focus, and it could bring together the cross-government focus and responsibility for children and young people. We know other countries have done it, and some states and territories have done it as well. Victoria, for example, has a Minister for Children. So that would be a much needed and welcomed action.
Next question, Gemma Daly, Director of the Press Club.
Thank you so much for the speeches. Amazing. I was sitting next to Connor, who pointed out something that I didn't realise, which is the lack of support for children who don't have necessarily a parent involved in the system. So apart from the Minister for Families, what sort of priority is that? And you reflected that on the speech. The second question, the Minister for Families, great idea federally, but there's a lot of interface with the states, obviously. So do you think there needs to be some oversight of the actions that are taken and what that might look like to give people some transparency over these things?
Thank you very much. I'll start on the first part of the question, and absolutely we know from research, we know from advocacy amongst young people that when young people, often aged 14 to 17, are trying to seek help alone without a protective parent, often mum, that the system really has very little options available to them. And I'll tell you a short account from a young girl that I interviewed in South Australia recently as part of the work for their Royal Commission. She made what was an incredibly courageous decision to leave an abusive family home. At that point, she contacted a homeless shelter who let her know that they would not take a young person without a parent. No further supports were offered. She contacted a youth service who told her that there was a waiting list for 3 months before they could help her get safe housing. So she slept in a paddock out the back of that youth housing service until a spot became available. On the days that she felt up to it, she went to school. A teacher at school became aware of her circumstances. So that teacher let her know that she'd open up the swimming pool earlier in the morning so she could have a shower before she went to school. That teacher, the school, didn't offer any further supports. That's a system that's not working. That's not a unique story in those that I've heard and those that have been documented across a range of different accounts of young people's experiences of seeking help without a parent. Importantly though, there are models of how we could do this. In Victoria, for example, Melbourne City Mission has developed the Amplify model, which is embedding specialist family violence services within a youth housing service. So if we want to avoid homelessness for young victim survivors, we need to be funding those types of interventions at scale.
Just on the second part of your question, I think it's important to acknowledge we've made some progress in terms of the federal government's relationship with state and territories. We now have a national strategy to prevent and respond to child sexual abuse. That wasn't the case only 3 years ago. We're seeing, and this is partly thanks to the advocacy and leadership of former National Children's Commissioner Anne Hollands, we're seeing an increased role for the federal government as it relates to youth justice. And so there is federal leadership. Gender-based violence is on the agenda of National Cabinet. The point you're making about transparency is a really important one. As a social change organisation, we're oftentimes pushed from state and territory governments. No, that's the responsibility of the federal government. Even at a federal government level, we're pushed between different parts of the bureaucracy. And so both government, but also more generally in terms of who they're funding, there's got to be transparency with regards to responsibilities. And by extension, there must be transparency in terms of where funding is going. And I think that's where we've got some work to do.
Thanks.
Can I just ask about language? We touched on it briefly before the addresses. Language is very useful to put kind of words around experiences, and once you can actually articulate them, then we can address them if they're, negative experiences. But they can also have a bit of a double-edged sword in terms of language being used, particularly around talking about behaviours of young men, that can further push them along a road that could be a throwaway language applied can also be really problematic. Matt, can I ask you, we talked a little bit about this before.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. I think it's a really important question. It's very hard to connect with, build relationship with, motivate change with folks who you're putting on the back foot. If you have a look at the research we're launching today, you won't find the words toxic masculinity in that research. That's deliberate. As part of our work in schools, we don't use that language. It does put boys on the back foot. If we're going to make progress, we've got to talk about the strengths. We've got to connect with where boys are at. We do a lot of work with boys to help them reflect on what they value, how they want to live their lives, how they show up in ways that are in line with those values. Virtues like love, compassion, kindness. When you're attaching your identity to these socially constructed ideas of gender, you'll be on tenuous footing. And to find a way into a conversation which starts with strengths and really promotes reflection on the way you want to live your lives, you're going to have to be really mindful in terms of the language you're using that's welcoming people into that conversation.
Julie Hare, Director of the National Press Club.
Thank you both very much for your speech. Less amazing, more harrowing, I would say. It's been quite something to be in this room and listen to you both. Cause for reflection. So I've got a two-pronged question that are related. First of all, earlier this year there was an extraordinary 4-part drama series called Adolescence that was released. I would like to get your thoughts about how that opened up debates about the issues that you're talking about. A 13-year-old boy who kills a girl who has rejected him, etc. And on the back of that, I would like you to reflect to me about the intersection of kids who come from violent, sexual abuse backgrounds and the juvenile justice system. So we know in the Northern Territory that the age of culpability is now being dropped to 10 again. In Victoria, it's 12, and yet there is a legal doctrine called, where did I write it? Dolly Incapax, which basically says that children aged 10 to 14 can't form criminal intent. And yet you spoke about Leo, who was that criminal intent, like where does he kind of sit in all of this?
Julie, I might start with your first question, and then Kate, you've done a significant amount of work on Dolly Incapax, and so I'll leave that for you. Starting with the positive on adolescence, and answer your question, yes, it's really good to see these issues propelled into the mainstream, thanks to the contribution of that Netflix series. What I think is unfortunate, and I note that series drew comment from the Prime Minister reflecting on the merits of playing a series like that in schools. mindful of the evidence that we've shared today, we've had 1,000 days elapse since the Australian Child Maltreatment Study. It's unfortunate that it's taken a drama to get these issues on the national agenda, when we would argue that there's sufficient drama in the evidence of real children and young people's everyday lives. Right, pass to you on Dolly and Capax.
It's a very good point, Matt. Julia, as we mentioned, the intersection between young people who are being caught up, and increasingly so, in a very punitive youth justice system across several of the Australian states and territories, and young people who have experienced violence and abuse has been documented quite widely. In the work that Jesuit Social Services does, over 80% of program participants having those experiences. Work by 54 Reasons and Save the Children recently from Queensland found 100% of young people in youth justice settings had experienced violence themselves. So I do think that we need to grapple with the very uncomfortable reality that these young people, victim survivors first and foremost, the first time that they will be interviewed by police will be for their own use of violence. Police may have attended their home and completely ignored them, not seen them or their victimisation, but they will be thrown through a punitive justice system. And as you note, increasingly so at a younger and younger age. Australia is a signed up member. We have ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. That convention is crystal clear that we should not criminalise children under the age of 14 years old. And there's been over 2 decades of advocacy in this country, including by Jesuit Social Services, to raise the minimum age of criminal responsibility, not to raise it above basic international obligations, just to meet that international obligation. So we should all be extremely concerned that we're now seeing that age move in the reverse.
And to be clear, we're talking about a majority of those kids in the criminal justice system for Indigenous families, right?
And we've spoken on intergenerational trauma. And what we see, untreated trauma, becomes intergenerational trauma.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Just a quick question on the report. I noticed there's 2 age groups, so the younger age group and then getting older into your mid-30s. A lot of consistency, but there are some other consistencies where some of those kind of thoughts have changed. Can you tell us a little bit about the ones that have changed and what the data tells us about why? And is that an opportunity to move with the positive change, presuming it is positive?
Yeah, thank you, Corey. So we came to this work initially through our Adult Man Box work, and that was first conducted in 2018 and then subsequently in partnership with Respect Victoria. I know Helen Bolton, CEO of Respect Victoria, is with us today. We're really grateful for that partnership. Morris picked it up front. Really grateful for that partnership. We looked at how these results compare to the results of the Adult Man Box research. And one area where there has been really significant progress is this idea that boys and men should show up as emotionally stoic. They should never reveal vulnerability. I think that old adage of boys don't cry is one that we've made really significant progress on. That's in part to your question, I think, because of what's been a really public conversation about mental health. And so we've seen the ability for boys and men to engage safely in that conversation, and in turn we see progress. I think the areas where we've got a significant amount of work to do go to ideas that boys should always be in control. They should always be dominant, be on top. And those ideas particularly impact upon the way that boys relate to others, including women and girls. Those, I guess, ideas of masculinity that underpin the way men relate to others in their life rather than more internally orientated are where we're seeing stagnation.
Okay. It's very good to be able to see that those sorts of broader conversations that are systemic, there's lots of places where you will see this actually make a difference. Ellie Searson Prakash from Lady News.
Elise from Lady News. We're a feminist independent news platform highlighting the voice of family, sexual and domestic violence lived experience. Firstly, I would like to express our gratitude for the work that you're doing in this space. Family, sexual and domestic violence is alleged in most family court cases. Yet the culture still minimises women's and children's experiences of trauma. If government really want to fix the public safety crisis, that's what I call it, would you agree that they need to spot the rot in what we're hearing about in their systems before investing in reforms or a federal minister for children?
Thank you so much for that question. I just want to acknowledge how important platforms like yours are for sharing stories by victim survivors. So thank you so much for creating that safe space. There's been a lot documented for 3 decades about the harms of the family court system, and there has not been nearly enough action in response to that documentation. We have review after review after review that's made often similar recommendations that have far too often been shelved. So without doubt, our family court system traumatises, often mothers with histories of family violence victimisation that go through it. It's not too dissimilar from many of our criminal justice systems in that respect, where women victim survivors often describe the justice system as their second abuser and express the re-traumatisation of those processes. I do think within that we are seeing some willingness to engage and to change, and I want to acknowledge Hayley Foster's leadership within the court in that space, and absolutely we should demand more. And given that it is a fragile system, there's a responsibility there. So I think we're at the early stages of change. I'm hopeful for that, but I'm also not naive as to the extent of the harms that have been underway and the extent of change that's needed if that is going to be a safe space for parents and for children who have been impacted by domestic, family and sexual violence.
Matt, how can we incorporate your findings in the Man Box Report into the family court for children?
Yeah, just to echo Kate, really grateful for Hayley's leadership, also the Chief Justice's leadership on this. I think the reality of the family court is that they are inherently constrained. Both Kate and I are engaging with them. They've got a very short amount of time with children. I think they do a really good job in the time they've got in connecting and trying to understand need. I think one of the things that we hope really comes out of this work and is integrated relates to risk. These stereotypical ideas of gender, they really matter, and the little amount of time that Hayley and her team have got with them to dig in a little bit on the reality of who those children are being exposed to at home, including, you know, men who are oftentimes responsible for, as you've touched on, the reasons why they're in the court. And so we'll work with Hayley and the Chief Justice to integrate these findings into not just the family court, but we hope more generally as well.
Thank you.
And final question is Maurice Riley, the CEO of the National Press Club.
I'm the youngest of 5 males in a pretty normal sort of household. My mother did a great job, I have to say. But I would sneak up to the far bedroom, and under my eldest brother's, he's died, so there's no recriminations today, you know, there'd be Playboy or something underneath the mattress, and, you know, the line was, we're reading it for the stories. Access to porn today is dramatically different, isn't it? You know, and so I wonder, whilst we're talking about the social media ban, you can still access websites. There's a plethora of them. It's very hardcore compared to an era in which I grew up. So I wonder whether we should go a bit further. You know, e-Safety Commissioner and, you know, ban porn sites. You know, I know it's hard to say this, you know, freedom of speech and censorship and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, it's doing a lot of harm. Yep. So that's my basic question. How far should we go? with, because technology and that industry is ahead of everybody. How far should we go and how quickly should we do it? And my second question, if I may, how much more money do you think we need to invest in the system? Are we talking billions, millions?
Yeah. Morris, I might start with your first question and I guess start by acknowledging progress. We've got an e-safety commissioner and a government who's committed to age verification as it relates to pornography. And I want to, I guess, address a myth that I think has sort of bubbled to the surface around this, which is this idea that young people will just VPN around it. Absolutely, that will happen. But do we say that because young people get their hands on alcohol, that we're not going to make alcohol illegal for young people? Of course not. And so first thing to say is that we've seen progress, and the age verification as it relates to pornography will absolutely reduce harm. Second thing to say, and we've heard from young people in this study, and you've acknowledged this, is that pornography is no longer the magazine that sits under a bed in the family home. Pornography is increasingly violent, it's misogynistic, it's degrading of women, and the literacy, particularly amongst adults, about the reality of mainstream pornography, I think there's some work to do. Incest themes are common when you visit mainstream pornography websites, and we run a helpline, Stop It Now, which is for people who are at risk of sexually abusing a child. It's a child sexual abuse prevention service for people who have got concerns about their thoughts or behaviours towards children. Almost always, pornography comes up as a way that people calling that service have found their way to child sexual abuse material. And so there's just been a fundamental shift in what pornography is. And to your question around should we go further, we're really encouraged to see the UK government just this week commit to banning any content that relates to strangulation. And so that's a particular type of harmful content, and I want to acknowledge the work of Marie Crabb here, who has over and over again pointed out that, to be blunt, it's not a safe way to engage as it relates to sex. There are really significant health implications, and yet we know that young people are observing that in pornography, and that's translating directly into the way that they engage with one another as it relates to sex.
And perhaps I'll just add on that and really echo what Matt has said there. One of, I think, the really important feature of the UK amendment that's come in this week is that it puts a positive obligation on pornography sites to ensure that content is not viewed. So not only do they need to remove it afterwards, but they actually need to ensure it doesn't even get on their platform, and it extends to choking, gagging and strangulation. We know that acts of non-fatal strangulation are one of the leading risk indicators that a woman will be killed within an abusive, intimate partner relationship. These are incredibly dangerous acts of control in the context of coercive control, and yet amongst young people, they're becoming normalised. That is terrifying. So we should look to the UK and follow suit without doubt. Morris, I'm blanking on your second question. Funding.
Yeah, the funding.
It's always good to talk about funding when you're not the person that has to write the cheque. But as Matt has already touched on, there's definitely been progress, and I think it is really important to acknowledge that. The federal government has committed just over $4 billion since 2022 to support efforts under the current national plan to end violence against women and children. I'd be a little bit cheeky here and looking to Tim Richardson, the Victorian Parliament Secretary for Men's Behaviour Change, note that Victoria as a state alone has committed $4 billion to address family violence since 2016, which is more than all other states and territories at the time combined. What we've never seen, despite being at a record level for this issue, is funding commensurate with the scale of the challenge. We spend more on submarines than we do on keeping women and children in this country alive and stopping them from experiencing violence and allowing them to recover, supporting them to recover and heal when they do. We ask critical questions of prevention. when it, on average, receives less than 3% of a funding bucket that is already too small. And we ask frontline services to turn up day in and day out when they do not have the resources to answer the calls that are coming in. And there are not the housing options funded and available to ensure that women and children escaping family violence can be safe. And so we're shocked when they end up in motel rooms with absolutely no support. Additional funding at the federal, state and territory level is absolutely needed if our actions are going to match the rhetoric.